podcast created by the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Our mission is to help you understand your world better through geography. This podcast describes the struggle to establish Minnesota's southern and eastern borders during its territorial years and before becoming a state in 1858. Political geography includes the study of the process and location of borders. Studying the creation of political boundaries is always interesting, owing to the human forces contesting the location of those borders. This southern border study is no different. What national issues are reflected in the Minnesota border creation process? There are several other podcasts about Minnesota borders in this series. The Border Podcast series can be used to supplement the use of the Minnesota Giant Map program by teachers and classes. The Minnesota Giant Map is available through MAGE. Learn more about the Minnesota Giant Map program at the MAGE website. An interactive map of Minnesota, which provides images, text, and sound for a number of locations in Minnesota, can also be found at the MAGE website and might be used to supplement the Minnesota Giant Map experience for your students. There are supporting materials which may be downloaded from links on the MAGE site where this podcast is housed. In addition, on some devices, this podcast shows visuals, chapter controls, and clickable internet links. This podcast is directed at 6th and 8th grade geography students, their teachers, and addresses several Minnesota geography standards. Dr. David Lanegren is the director of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. He is also a professor of geography at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dr. Lanegren is a longtime, highly respected promoter of improved geographic education in Minnesota. I am Fred Kunze, a member of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. And now, here's Dr. Lanegren.
This map of the United States from 1808 gives us a glimpse into the tumultuous debates and visions held of the United States' future by powerful men and women living in that time. Their decisions on political boundaries have formed our contemporary political culture. And even though today we take these borders of our states for granted, there was a time when they were hotly contested. And the debates and discussions of that time inform the present political structure of the United States and tell us how we became Minnesotans. And in this case, I want to talk about the southern boundary of Minnesota and why we are not citizens of Iowa. The map shows us the United States just before the War of 1812. It gives us a view of the vagueness of the geographical knowledge of the time and also the supple ideas that people put forth about the bringing of new territories into the United States. You can see on this map the East Coast and the 13 colonies that formed the United States, but you can also see some very interesting things in the interior, particularly the area north of the Ohio and south of the Great Lakes, and to that red line that runs along a wavy line of rivers through Rain. It says Rain Lake on the map. We now call that Rainy Lake. And then Lake of the Woods. And the cartographers knew the Lake of the Woods was there, but didn't know what it was like. And then a line southwest from Lake of the Woods to what they thought might be the headwaters of the Mississippi River, which is, of course, not the headwaters of the Mississippi, but that's another story. So the area that's now North Dakota and northwest Minnesota was part of the British territories. And then down the Mississippi. So that's the old boundary, the Revolutionary War boundary of the United States, down the Mississippi to the Gulf. And then the map shows us Louisiana, recently purchased by the United States, but very poorly understood. And the map, of course, indicates that, just some squiggly lines for rivers. And then down to the southwest, the border between Louisiana, between the United States and New Spain, and here the province of New Mexico. So this is a tumultuous time. The Republic of Texas hadn't come into existence, and big portions of the United States were unorganized. And there was a great discussion at the time about whether these new territories should be colonies or should they be states. And the decision was made that they would become states. So we're going to focus today on the Northwest Territory, the area north of the Ohio. But if you look to the south of Tennessee, you see there's Mississippi Territory, and that later would become the states of Mississippi and Alabama, and then further south, Florida. But you'll notice that there's a line separating Florida from the United States, because at this time the future of Florida was not certain. The United States wanted it, but the Spanish still held it. Our story then is the Northwest Territory. And the important thing about the Northwest Territory was it was agreed that the states that were formed in the Northwest Territory would be free states. So in the Congress, both in the House of Representatives and the Senate, there was a great discussion about how many states should be created from the Northwest Territory. And they were so-called big state advocates. They wanted fewer states in the Northwest Territory, with basically the Southerners. And then there were the small state advocates who wanted a large number of states, and hence a large representation in the Senate. So we have large states and small states. So the first state created was Iowa. But if we now go to our next map, which will be the map from 1830, a different map maker, so we see lots of different features on the map, and we won't go into all those. But by 1830, 4 states had been created. In addition to Ohio, we now have Indiana and Illinois and Michigan, and we can see Wisconsin Territory. So Wisconsin Territory extended out to the Mississippi, the old boundary of the Northwest Territory. And now we see Arkansas and Missouri and Louisiana, which had been created out of the Louisiana Purchase. And then the land north of Missouri, it's not labeled on this map. It's just given the names of the Indians that occupied it, because of course it was not part of the Northwest Territory and hadn't yet been organized or conceived of as a place. So the debate continued. How many states should be created out of the Northwest Territory? It's interesting to look at these maps, and we can get a good sense of what was going on at the time. In the Northwest Territory, the place names are physical features, primarily rivers, the names of the Native Americans who owned and ruled the territory, and the forts. So we can see Fort Howard in Wisconsin and Fort Snelling in Minnesota, Fort Winnemongo, and so on. Because in the territory, the Army, the U.S. Army, really enforced laws for the Americans that lived there, while the Native American population laws governed all the Native people. You can also see a little bit in the northern part of Wisconsin on this map, a fur factory. So we get a little sense of the economics of the time and what might happen in the future. Now, as we look at our next map, this is a map showing many, many things. It's based on the great map done by Nicolet, the geographer, cartographer, astronomer, who came to the United States with the sole purpose of making a major cartographic contribution. This is the first really accurate map of the time. It's not completely accurate, but it was the most accurate map up to that time. And on this map, we can see the new territory of Iowa, which was basically the land west of the Mississippi out to the Missouri River, and then the territory of Wisconsin. So we have two territories here, and then in addition to the careful topographic mapping that Nicollet did with latitude and longitude, we can see the county boundaries put in here that reflect the advancing agricultural frontier and urban frontier of the United States. So the process was to go from native land, which was then purchased by the federal government, then territories or areas would petition to become a territory based on the number of people living there, American citizens living there, that is. And then, so the territory would be organized, and it would have a constitution. And then when the population got large enough, they would become a state. So there was lots of arguments about territorial size, territorial shape, and the very intriguing process. Well, in this case, in Wisconsin became a separate territory, and then Iowa became a separate territory. And then Wisconsin and Iowa were growing at about the same rate, and they came into the Union about the same time, but not exactly the same time. So in 1836, Wisconsin Territory was created, and it extended all the way to the Missouri, and then in 1838, Iowa Territory split off of Wisconsin. And there were some votes to be a state in Iowa, but Iowa didn't want to become a state. They liked having the federal government pay for everything. So they actually tried 3 times to become a state, 3 different elections. And finally in 1844, it was agreed in Iowa that they would decide, they would put forth to become a state. The question was, how big would the state of Iowa be? And for that discussion, the people in Congress and people in Iowa used Nicollet's map of the upper Mississippi. Again, the most accurate map of the time, but as we said before, not really accurate. So the tension was, should the state be very small and run just in the eastern part of Minnesota and eastern Iowa? One of the interesting and curious things about the maps of the time is that the Americans used a different prime meridian. So latitude and longitude were based on Washington, D.C. So you can see the grid here is degrees west of Washington. So but basically the territory was to run from the Missouri border northward to about Prairie du Chien in the eastern part of Iowa and Minnesota. That was the small state. The big state was to run along the northern border of Missouri to the Missouri River, up the Missouri River to its junction with the Sioux River, near this area on the map shown as Omaha Indian Country. And from that approximate location of the junction of the 2 rivers, a straight line running northwest to the big bend in the St. Peter's River, or we now call the Minnesota River, at about where the Blue Earth River flows into the now Minnesota River. They weren't quite right on that. They didn't know exactly where that was. The wording on the map is a little confusing, but anyway, that was the location. And then the boundary would go down the Minnesota River to the Mississippi River, and then down the Mississippi River. Now, if that had been the map that people liked, or the boundaries that people liked, the Twin Cities would be part of Iowa. And the Falls of St. Anthony and so on would be a major feature on the border of Iowa, and I'm guessing that they probably would have tried to tinker with that border to capture the falls, but they didn't at the time. So these 2 conflicting ideas went forward. One of the major concerns of the people of Iowa was the presence of the very powerful Dakota population, shown here on his map as the various bands of the Dakota. You can see the Sisseton quite clearly, and the Wahpeton, Mindiwatnakan. These are all called countries, given these vague boundaries. And the Iowa farmers were concerned about would, in fact, the Native American population give up their territory, and what would it cost the residents of Iowa to try to govern this territory? And they feared that desperados and renegades would leave the agricultural and urban areas of Iowa and flee into Indian country and pose a constant threat to the agriculturalists. So there was an opposition to the big state. So the two state boundaries went to the Congress in 1845 about the boundaries. The Iowans really did not want a small state, and the decision finally came in 1846 when Senator Douglas, in March 27th of 1846, said, "Okay, you guys, I'm drawing the line at 43 degrees 30 minutes north." He said, now that line, which is the present boundary of the state, is an approximate straight line that goes along the divide between rivers that flow south into Iowa and rivers that flow north into Minnesota. That's not precisely the boundary, but it was close enough, and by that time people wanted to be sure they became a state, so the argument was decided in Congress, and in December 28th, 1846, Iowa became a state, and by establishing its northern border, the southern border of Minnesota was established, and the Falls of St. Anthony, the valley of the Minnesota River, the rich agricultural land of southeast Minnesota, and the river towns along the Mississippi were all secured for the future state of Minnesota.
You have been listening to a production of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Visit the MAGE website now. At our website, you can find many geography resources, links, lessons, student enrichments, geography podcasts, annotated geography websites, geography curriculum suggestions, and much more, all for free. The Minnesota Alliance is a nonprofit group of volunteer educators who work to promote an enhanced understanding of our world through improved geographic literacy. Background music is courtesy of Jim Hogue of Decorah, Iowa. This is Fred Kunze.